So I'm honored to be speaking to Natalia Kucirkova today. Natalia's work spans from academia to industry. She is professor of early childhood development at University of Stavanger, professor of reading and children's development at the Open University, and visiting professor at UCL. She is also the co-founder and CEO of WiKIT, about she will tell us today. She has been awarded numerous fellowships and awards in education, innovation, and research. Her current work on evidence is of great interest to the EdTech field and indeed the motivation for my invite to speak here today. Thank you for joining us, Natalia.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So you've published several articles about impact evaluations and evidence in EdTech, the latest of which the summary of EdTech impact evaluation frameworks and your evidence evaluation routine. I would like to ask you, what are to kind of get the ball rolling and start our chat today? What are the recommendations and takeaways for EdTech founders and startups in terms of evidence? What is a way to kind of approach evidence for someone who's starting to develop their EdTech solution?
Thanks. That's a good question. I would say start early. It's very important that as we build and develop and test new technologies, new solutions, that evidence is an integral part of it. So it's not something to be added later on, but really trying to see what research has been published on this topic, what different studies can I find as a startup founder in the area of my interest, and see if my idea as a startup founder resonates or is related to that specific study, and making sure that evidence doesn't come as a sort of ad hoc idea that, oh, we actually do need to back this up by some research, but rather that it starts from the research.
Okay, very interesting distinctions here, and probably it's the right moment to delve into like existing standards of evidence, what exists, like kind of a view. Probably the listener, like our listeners, do have some level of idea, but again, why have you developed ever, and what were you finding? Like, what do you think are the frameworks that are useful for a certain goal, but perhaps are not satisfying other goals? Can you give us a kind of an overview of the whole scene?
Okay, well, let's start with the different standards of evidence then. So different countries use different frameworks. When you look at the sort of Anglo-American countries or English-speaking countries, the global north countries, we see that the frameworks are being adapted from education to education technology. So they are not frameworks that have been specifically developed for EdTech, but they are being adopted from other educational resources. And those kinds of evidence standards are looking at the outcomes that we would like to see also with EdTech in terms of, what's the learning effect over time? Are children actually acquiring more new words when they're using a language platform, or are they more motivated to learn? So you'll be looking at standard outcomes within education and adopting them to EdTech. And those kinds of standards exist in US under the ESSA standards framework, in Australia under AERO. You've got the NESTA standards of evidence in England that have been looking actually more specifically at the level of innovation connected to EdTech standards. But then you also have these international bodies like UNESCO, World Bank, where they're essentially looking at what are smart buys or cost-effective EdTech solutions out there. And they again have their own criteria that are synergistic with the other criteria out there in terms of looking at the learning impact over time. So even though different countries or different educational frameworks have their own criteria, there are some common features across them. Now, that said, we don't have one global benchmark for EdTech. We do have some global reports like the GM report by UNESCO, where they've been looking at the overall impact of technologies over time. And as you know, the report has been widely covered in various media outlets in terms of the lack of evidence when it comes to technology's impact on learners and the importance of teachers and learners being really centered in technology. So the slogan, learning on our terms, tech on our terms. Mm.
So you mentioned ESSA, NESTA, Aero standards. Now these standards all look into the into measuring impact, right? And as you were mentioning earlier, though, in the broad term of evidence, some people have used, or some edtech companies, perhaps some founders have used the term evidence, saying, okay, we're backed in the learning sciences. We have a pedagogical kind of theory behind our developing our solution. But they have not run randomized control trials. They have not run pre-post tests. So with evidence, they're actually talking about, well, there's a theory behind the solution we have developed. Instead, in the frameworks you mentioned, all of these frameworks do have measurement attached to kind of the tiers of evidence level that they kind of publish, right? In slightly different ways. Maybe we can touch upon the tiers and like the level of evidence. So are we to say that probably just having a backing in theory is not what we mean as evidence in EdTech?
Right. Well, I would say that it's about different level of evidence. So if you think about ESSA standards, then having a learning theory or a theory of change that illustrates how your specific solution matches with different research studies and having a research plan, those kinds of things are the sort of lower tier of evidence. So it is still evidence, but it's at a different level of rigor or significance. So I think as long as we talk about evidence as an independent research-based demonstration of impact, then we can have a shared understanding of these different levels. I have seen more confusion around evidence and even the word research when it comes to different testimonials and different sort of views and attitudes from users. So very often founders come to us and say, look, but we have evidence that teachers love our product, and that to them is sufficient to satisfy, say, their investors or the procurement teams. And indeed, it has been the case in EdTech that as long as it was perceived as useful and enjoyable and motivational, that was kind of, as I say, sufficient for the people who make investments in EdTech.
Yeah.
But as we have seen, all of us during the pandemic, and as these many reports and studies are showing, it is not enough to be engaged or to enjoy the use of a certain platform. We do need to have evidence or proof that it actually improves learning, because we are talking about educational technologies rather than any kind of technology. So I think it's more that distinction that is important to me, that with evidence we do mean some proper research.
Yeah. Okay, so you were saying like backing in theory is a first tier of evidence, a first level of evidence. Maybe
In
it's
some of the frameworks, yeah, or in many of the frameworks, yeah.
maybe it's a good time to pull out kind of a graph showing the various standards of evidence, and maybe we can work them through like with a startup mentality and think of like what can a startup do? How can a startup hope to produce some level of evidence? And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you a little bit about what we do at WiKIT, which is university spin out the University of Stavanger, and we started working in the Nordics and expanded globally now. But basically, what we do is to support companies with these different standards. So if I go to this slide, you can see the international standards of evidence mapped on essentially simple visual that is included in one of the reports we produce in WiKIT. And this is freely available. Anyone can read it and critically let us know what they think about it. But essentially here you have 4 standards that are out there. None of them is mandatory at the moment, so it doesn't, it's not prescriptive in any of these countries, but it's perceived as very important. And indeed, there are now developments at the US governmental level at looking at SI in more detail and in terms of how compulsory it becomes for the different districts.
Something
But
I read from the table here is like on the lower levels of evidence, a logic model, right? And I'm wondering, so let's kind of work through this from the viewpoint of a startup. I think a logic model is an important instrument for a startup, not just in terms, as we were saying, of producing evidence. It's not really a way to produce an evidence. It just produces the idea that you're doing what you're doing with a logic, basically. But
Oh, I
while
would
it
be very
doesn't.
surprised. Yeah, totally. I mean, I would be very surprised if a startup didn't have a logic model already, right? You need to know what are the different inputs and activities happening, and then have some kind of vision or mission for your company in terms of what is the impact we want to see over time. But the difference here is that it's a logic model that is research based, right? So you are modeling these activities and making assumptions based on some research studies rather than just your own hypotheses. So that is why it's important that when startups want to have their logic models aligned with these different standards, then ideally they would have them independently verified by researchers, right? So a lot of the work that we do at WiKIT is essentially reviewing the logic models that different startups have and supporting them with additional research studies, discussing with them, okay, where is this specific assumption coming from? Which feature within your product is aligned with this specific research study or this scientist that you are citing? You know, it's that kind of work. So a lot of these I would say criteria within the standards are not going to be surprising or questionable. It's more like, how do you pull it together, and how do we support the EdTech community in aligning with those standards? So you're absolutely right that the logic model is the sort of beginning for all startups. Yeah.
And as you mentioned, working with startups. Now, what level kind of what stage of development of a startup do you usually work with, or is it most likely to work with at the end of the day? Because I mean, a startup that is still in pre-seed, their budget is so limited. They barely have budget at all. They have the founder's time, right? So perhaps working with them might be challenging. Whereas I don't know, maybe definitely once there's Series A, finally they have considerable funding, but perhaps they are already past the logic model stage, and they might already be seeking further levels of evidence. So what stage startups do you work with? How can you work with them? And yeah, and let's then from there build up more on the levels of evidence from, you know, Series A startups and more well-funded startups with a bigger consumer base or customer base.
Yeah. So I would say that even with the big companies, independently verifying their logic model is always a good exercise. So it's not something that you sort of lose when you are building your customer base. Indeed, because many of the companies evolve over time, or most of them evolve over time, in the sense that you build new features and you add new possibilities, new activities to your technology. That means that you need to have some logic behind those as well. So that kind of ongoing work is happening at all levels of companies. So it's really not just for startups. But you ask also about the cost. There are possibilities for receiving support for the work with researchers. So our work at WiKIT is subsidized to some extent by the Jacobs Foundation, which supports the EdTech ecosystem in being more evidence-based. So there are various possibilities for subsidies with a lot of these studies, especially with the ESSA-aligned research studies, not only by the Jacobs Foundation, but also other philanthropic funders out there. Different companies can apply for different research grants, even though they tend to be more aligned with research goals of specific scholars or academics rather than the specific company. So, the funding situation is something that I'm very aware of, and I'm trying to support in any way we can. WiKIT is run as a social enterprise, but the levels of standards sort of mirror the pricing structure in the sense that if you think about a logic model which takes a researcher a few hours, that's very different from running an RCT that costs, say, $1 million, right? So you really need to think about the size of the company in terms of the cost of the different studies.
Yeah. So let's work through these levels of evidence. We've started with the very well. You corrected me when I said early stages. It's not necessarily early stages because well-known.
It's early stage in the development. You're absolutely right. It's early stage in the development, but the development of the feature could be for the startup, but it could also be for a mature company, right?
Sure. Of course.
Yeah.
So let's work through these tiers. What's the next steps after logic models and seeing whether the theory behind the development of the solution is kind of evidence-based? What's the next step?
Yeah, well, in these standards they're looking at, let's take, say, ESSA and the Australian standards of evidence. It's looking at studies that look at the relationship or correlation between the outcome that you would like to see in the students or in the teachers, in your users, and a feature or the whole product that you have as a company. So to think about, as an example, you can be correlating the motivation that students have as they are using your product. And that kind of study gives you some confidence, some correlational confidence that there is this relationship, something is happening. Now, of course, this is not something that you can just sort of observe. It will be good to measure it with some data and have a statistically significant correlation. Ideally, we often say to researchers who work with EdTech companies that it's important to have it peer-reviewed and published as a research article, even though there are companies who need this evidence very quickly, and we need to have that sort of rapid cycle of evaluation. And in that case, it would be more like a report or a study that is peer-reviewed within the network of researchers rather than a journal article.
And
but essentially, that's correlational evidence.
Sorry for interrupting you. Are you able, as WiKIT, to like organize all of that, including like the peer review and like fast-paced peer review amongst the scientists that are within your network?
Right. So when it comes to the independent publishing, so publishing in an academic journal, no researchers can make that faster, right? Because that's a separate system of journal publishing, and that is where we need to comply with the deadlines that these different journals have. And it might be that during the peer review there are some issues or errors that need to be corrected, and then the whole publication takes much longer. So we cannot, make that quicker. What we
Okay.
can
Yeah.
do within the network is to ensure that a company that would like to have, say, a correlational or promising evidence for the ESA standards, we work with research partners who can run those studies for the company within schools. And at the end, they get a report that says, okay, this company has achieved a certain level of standards, and they get the badge of the ESA aligned standard, and that is how they achieve their specific level of evidence. So it is entirely possible. In fact, I think I've got the slide that shows this here. So you can see that the different standards are mapped here on the types of research studies that can be conducted by different EdTech companies, and the ways in which we at WiKIT support the companies.
Yeah.
So this is specifically about our research network, but there are also other research companies, research consultancy companies, research firms that support different EdTech founders. So just to sort of talk you through this.
Yeah.
If you think about the usability and pedagogy, right, the light blue arc here, those will be the feasibility, usability testing studies, so things that founders often do at the beginning of launching their product, when they speak with different teachers, different head teachers, and indeed the children, if this is aiming at children. To make sure that the technology is actually aligned with what is happening in the classroom, that teachers like it, children like it. Those are your customer reviews and feasibility, usability testing. So that's like the big arc. And I would say that most companies that operate within schools have that kind of evidence. But they might not have it certified, or they might not have it independently verified. Then you sort of move to the conceptual level of evidence, which is, you saw that in the standards by ESA and others, looking at the logic modeling, looking at the theory of change, theory of action. That is where you are as a company. We call that evidence ready. So that is how we develop that sort of service around it, so that it can be streamlined and offered to companies in a fairly quick way, so that we don't have those very long review processes as would be traditionally the case in academia. And then once you have been verified and checked for the conceptual basis of your product, so there is some rationale that your product works, then we can go to the observations and correlational studies. So, there is this sort of pathway, or sort of like a step-by-step approach, because if you skip these steps, then you sort of run a risk that say that you run a study and you notice during the study that might be quite expensive in the schools that actually there are many things that are not working here because no one tested the feasibility of this, right? So that is the reason why there are these different levels over time, because we need to make sure that you gradually build the evidence base. And that is partly why, oh, sorry.
This is focused on K to 12, right?
In WiKIT, we work mostly with K-12 companies, but the framework you're looking at here, that is applicable to EdTech across.
Yeah.
Of course, those that are, say, targeting employability with students at the universities, they would be looking at different type of, say, longitudinal studies, but they will be still sort of going through the different levels of usability, conceptual, qualitative, quantitative validation towards the end.
Yeah.
One thing that is different when it comes to these different types of technologies like K-12 or different products out there is that when you think about different screening mechanisms, so that is very popular in in schools when it comes to assessment, you know, that you have these screening tools for literacy, screening tool for mathematics, where are children, so that you can put them on a level in assessment. Those kinds of screening tools would be difficult to test with an RCT, but testing them with, say, the predictive validity study would make sense. So you adjust different methodologies to the different types of technologies that you are testing in schools.
I did
But you
want
still
to
keep the levels.
I did want to ask you precisely a question about that, which is there a risk, and or has there been a risk in the past? In fact, I'm pretty sure in the past this has happened, but perhaps in different contexts from the one we're talking about, and namely of kind of running a study, an impact evaluation. Let's say measuring the wrong thing. And what I mean with this here is there's an EdTech tool that perhaps is being used the wrong way, or is being used in not the way that is going to make a measurable impact. Let's imagine, I think this commonly used example of using a tablet in a classroom. If you just put a traditional textbook on a tablet, it's gonna make probably no difference, right? No significant difference. But if instead you adjust a textbook and it becomes a courseware, and it becomes, you introduce multimedia, you leverage Meyer's multimedia principles in the courseware, for example, right? And then there's your theory backing, and then most probably, if you go and measure the intervention in that case of having a tablet, and then, okay, tablets are not EdTech, they're just a technology that can empower EdTech, right? But this is kind of a very simple to understand example of what I meant is measuring the wrong thing. Is there the risk of this happening perhaps in independent studies, what's your thought about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good observation, because it is indeed the case that if EdTech founders decide to run a study without, say, talking with qualified or trained researchers, we often see that they are measuring the wrong thing, unfortunately. So in WiKIT, one of the things that we do is to also look at impact evaluations or studies that different companies have conducted themselves. And this is a work that is often commissioned by impact-related funds. So, the VCs who are really interested in impact. And in those cases, we often see that either the wrong thing was measured, or the key outcome was not measured in an optimal way, that the study could have been designed with a different methodology to really show impact. So that is why it's important to me to make sure that companies understand that research does need to go through these individual gradual steps so that you can build a good model that can be then tested with a rigorous methodology. Because, if you just sort of design quickly a study and without thinking through the unique features that your specific technology has, then not only that wrong things might be measured, but also the good things might be missed, because the study was designed in a way that is not really specific to the technology. And it's also perhaps good to mention in this context that when it comes to measuring things in terms of what is the impact, we often see that companies jump on the idea of looking at standardized measures, being the sort of key indicator that children are learning. Whereas if you do a good logic modeling and theory of change at the beginning, you can be thinking about the unique value your technology has that perhaps is not captured within the standardized assessments. So what I mean by that is that, you know, if you think about the recent PISA results and all the other big assessment frameworks out there, they do not necessarily look at, say, creativity or joyful atmosphere in classrooms, things that we do know are conducive to good learning, but they are not captured in the big standardized assessments. So EdTechs that are targeting these different skills and different outcomes also need to be able to demonstrate their evidence and to think carefully about the outcomes that we measure over time. So there it's extremely important that they collect data points from early on as they are building the evidence.
I kind of have a question that goes kind of beyond because the purpose of organizations like yours, like WiKIT and your services, are very clear. Whatever the circumstance, whether education is public or whether education is private, I think in both cases it's very important for EdTech solution providers to be able to find services like WiKIT services on the market. I'm wondering. Generally speaking, do you think that to some extent markets or educational markets would be able to self-regulate and kind of find evidence or through, of course, providers buying services or solution developers buying services like yours, kind of self-regulate and produce the right evidence that then consumers or customers would be able to kind of reliably pick out of the various solutions that are out there on the market, or is this wishful thinking? And in either case, have you seen this kind of form happening? I'm thinking, for example, of Education Alliance Finland kind of developing their stamp of approval that can then go on EdTech market app markets, and perhaps kind of signal to a customer base that is not within like a regulated market, no governmental interference, kind of actually being able to do this, but at the same time, the risk of a provider kind of giving a stamp that is not sufficiently reliable. What are your opinions on this?
Yeah, that's a good and difficult question. I guess the first thing I would say is that WiKIT is a network that has grown from a network to a network of networks, actually. So very often when our consultants support different companies, they also are consultants in their own consultancy companies. So it's important to me to make sure that it's the right people working together. So these days I work a lot as a basically matchmaker, making sure that the freelancers, the different researchers, the different professors, subject matter experts are matched with the right EdTech company so that they can work together on an evidence piece. And then, as I said, there will be various funding models for supporting that work. It might be directly between the consultant and the company. It might be through a subsidized service. But on this specific platform, you can see different consultants or freelancers who can offer mentorship services. So they can be booked for a short discovery call or just talking with the different companies to find out whether there is a good match, whether they can work together on a learning or a research piece together. And then you ask about these certifications. So in WiKIT, as you saw on the previous slide, we have several partnerships with different companies or providers out there. And that includes EdTech Impact that fused or acquired, Education Alliance Finland that you mentioned as well. And EdTech Impact is a platform where companies can showcase their evidence by earning various badges, depending on whether they have, for example, achieved a pedagogical certification that will be with the Education Alliance Finland, or whether they have, for example, looked at their data and algorithmic fairness and specific aspects related to data security and safety, which is supported in EdTech Impact with EDDS. And what WiKIT does in EdTech Impact is to support companies with their researched impact. So impact that has been researched in the past or over time. And that specific work also feeds into a badge within the vertical that can be then displayed on the EdTech Impact platform, and basically provides more visibility to the companies that when they have achieved the certification, they can be then more visible there. The broader question that you asked was kind of more about what do I think about these different certifications, right? Like, is there something that companies might feel, oh, I'm just buying these different badges, and what is the value of them? And I often say to companies to think about their overall plan in evidence, right? So as you are building your evidence portfolio, so you're collecting different research studies, you are thinking about how to involve various researchers within your advisory board, or perhaps within your own team, you might be recruiting new people. It's good to have a plan for it so that you are not just sort of randomly getting different awards or seals of approval, but there is a, there is a schedule, there is a calendar, and there is a plan for making sure that your solution aligns with a framework or some kind of standard. There isn't a global certification for EdTech in evidence at the moment. Very likely there will be something next year. And that is an important thought to have, because it means that companies that are early, they can then evidence fairly quickly once a certification comes into place, right? So regardless of the various awards and certifications out there, I think it's important that founders think about research and evidence as something to build into their products, and that you pursue this mission, if you like, with various studies, good quality research studies. And the likelihood is then that you'll match with a specific certification. But I'm not here to recommend one specific award or one specific certification. All I can say is that the network of researchers and learning scientists that I have the pleasure to lead, all of them will be trying to support the EdTech companies to make sure that they get the best evidence out there.
I think a part of the question was also in kind of the target audience, right? And I think what you're saying is like, think about what your target customer is, and there's probably, or at least the EdTech field is starting to specialize and build like the right badge and the right certification or the right evidence in whatever form for your specific area. Is this kind of what you're saying?
Partly, because you are right, it will depend on your target customer, and certainly we see at the companies that are either transitioning to US or have been operating in US, rapidly seeking our researchers' advice and support with the ESA standards, and aligning with those standards and the badges or the badging system within ESA. So there will be the sort of direct link to the target customer. So if you are targeting US schools, then you do need to have the ESA standards of evidence. But this will depend not only on the specific country where you're operating or geographical location, but also on the broader landscape of EdTech. So if you think about what happened to EdTech when generative AI started to be very popular, that immediately shifted the perspective from standards relevant for data to look at also generative AI, right? So we will have these periodic developments and updates to the specific criteria we are looking at. So it would be short-sighted to be thinking, okay, now, I don't know, Estonia is looking for this specific standard, so all I have to do is to meet that standard. That is why I'm saying that having a plan for what is happening this year, what will be happening next year, and overall thinking about the evidence portfolio is something that you commit to as a company. That is important.
Yeah, I would have so many questions, but we're already running over time. And thanks a lot for staying with me to discuss all of this today. I think I do want to mention, aside, of course, from to listeners to take more of a look on your website at the offerings of WiKIT services and the experts network tutoring services as well, and all of the very important work you do in EdTech. Also to check out the 2023 summary you published, I think, on the certifications topic, and especially like the question of like how is the mechanism for teachers, for example, to find out what is the right EdTech solution? You've published another paper on this topic, or research on this topic previously as well. But I think the 2023 summary also touches upon this, pedagogical certifications and kind of distinctions on this. And I think the broader question of, is this going to be self-regulating, is probably goes a little beyond the purposes of the interview today. But I think we've touched upon it, and listeners can keep researching the topic on your published papers for sure.
Thank
Well,
you. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I am sort of trying to walk the talk, because, you know, when it comes to EdTech and sort of the consultancy side, then it's important that people who support the EdTech industry have done the research themselves and have also done some development within the EdTech side, right? And that is something that I emphasize and look for in the EdTech freelancers that become affiliated with WiKIT, that it's not some kind of abstract academic research,
yeah.
but they have also worked within the industry, perhaps have spun out their own companies. So it's definitely not just me, and many of the articles are co-authored articles. So I've been privileged to work with many wonderful researchers in this space, and we still work on many different studies this year, and there'll be new publications coming out next year. So I do hope that we can keep this dialogue with your companies and different organizations.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad you mentioned this, because from a former startupper point of view, this of course has been a concern for many years, but I think it's finally really being addressed, like this academia industry, how do they link and how do they properly link kind of question. So yeah, I'm very glad you mentioned it. And of course, very glad we spent this time together today chatting about evidence, and thanks a lot for being with us.
Pleasure. Thank you.